Hello again and welcome to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, May 26th, 2016. Hello again everyone, I'm Mario Helwani inside our New York City studio. So great to be back for another live episode of the show. We got the A-team in the house, much to discuss. So let's get right into the show. That is Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post and SportsIllustrated.com. And of course, the man in the hat, Chuck Mindenhall, who's dressed very warmly on this very warm day. Chuck Mindenhall of MMAfighting.com.
Shed some pounds, you know
yes,
what I'm talking
well done on that front.
No IV rehydration, though.
Yes, and we'll get to that later on in the show. Nice little, what do they call that? A placeholder? No, foreshadowing. Foreshadowing. That's a job well done there by Luke. But first, we got to start with the McGregor, Diaz, sort of Mayweather madness. You know, for the last 2 weeks, we gave you guys a break. We didn't really talk about all of this, but a few things have changed over the last 7 days or so. So let's start with that. Conor McGregor has that meeting with the UFC on Wednesday of last week. Nate Diaz has his meeting with the UFC brass Friday, which he demanded in Stockton. Conor McGregor does a sit-down interview with ESPN on Sunday. On Monday comes out that he's going to be in the body issue of ESPN, the magazine. And then Wednesday on the MMA Hour, we had Nate Diaz. My first question to you guys off the bat, it's obvious that everyone, or for the most part, the MMA community was kind of like, really, we're going to do the rematch when it was first announced going to 200. It's obvious that there was more interest when Conor retired and that whole craziness with the press conference and all that prior to 197. It's obvious that the interest was raised. But now I'm starting to wonder, after all of this, what Conor said a little bit, what Nate said as well yesterday, is the fight bigger than ever? I'm starting to wonder, does this fight break 2 million pay-per-view buys if it actually happens?
It might.
It's crazy, right?
Really might. I really think that when they announced it, I remember joking because we were thinking, well, you know, how could you give McGregor and Diaz a rematch? It was for a weird weight class. There was no title. And he got finished in the second round. Holm went to the fifth. She was on the way to winning. That was for a title. Why wouldn't you grant her a rematch? And now I'm thinking, not that I wouldn't have minded seeing the Holm versus Tate rematch, but this is so far beyond their fight now. This has frankly almost nothing to do with it other than McGregor lost, and so that's part of the story. It's a labor relations battle. It's a star power battle. It's almost a generational battle in some ways because I think Conor McGregor is not quite from the same moment in time that Diaz came through the ranks. It is a struggle that encompasses so many different fault lines with so many different parties interacting in so many different dimensions that it's become, frankly, the most interesting thing in the sport right now. I can't wait to see the rematch. I never in a million years thought I was going to say that.
You know, I'm with you with almost everything you were saying, but I'm not sure how I'm not sure whether I translate that to I can't wait to see the rematch. Like I'm not that much more interested in seeing the fight, but I'm interested in the entire story surrounding the fight.
Wait a second. Notable fight purist Jeff Wagenheim is more interested in the drama than the actual fight. That goes against everything you've been telling us for the last few years.
You know why? Because what's changed for me is now the narrative, at least in my mind, is Nate Diaz is going to get paid, and that's really what makes him more interesting to me. Because we know Conor McGregor is going to get paid. He makes sure of that. He's the guy that goes out there and promotes his fights, and good for him. He gets a ton of money. But then they always bring in somebody else who's going to the other guy is always the other guy. And Diaz went out and beat him, and so in terms of competition, well, you would think that Diaz now should be getting paid the way McGregor is, and a lot of people scoff at that. Well, he's not as big a star, and maybe he isn't in the big picture. But for this fight, because Conor McGregor really wants this rematch, and because the UFC really wants this rematch, it's time for Nate Diaz to get paid, and that's to me the narrative here. I'm not sure that makes me want to see the fight, but it makes me want to follow the story.
I think it's interesting that there's this glittery sort of imaginary figure out there in Mayweather that hovers over this whole thing, and now both of those guys are sort of indirectly going at that side of it too, and it's that's only enhanced, I guess, the magnitude of this fight, like you were mentioning, all the multiple layers that are going into it, because we associate Mayweather now with money, the money team, everything that goes on. Suddenly, when both these guys are talking about Mayweather, sort of being this other guy who that they may go against, it just adds this dimension to it. And I think it's the boxing world. I mean, we've talked about like how these two things overlap. I feel like right now, we're getting some of that. So there's people in the boxing room, there's people from other sectors kind of looking in at this as this goes on. But it also helps that McGregor does get the Sunday conversation on on SportsCenter, and he's talking about he's mentioning all these types of things, and I just feel like it's taken on. I was one of those guys I think was a little bit reluctant when they first made the rematch for the very reasons you mentioned. I was like, well, it wasn't much of a fight. You're just going to give this guy a mulligan on an arbitrary fight that's thrown together with 11 days. But somehow all of that doesn't matter as much anymore. It's like whatever the way is. Maybe it was just listening to Diaz on your show yesterday, like just the way he communicates, the way he sells it, his truth, the way he tells the truth, his sincerity in those things. Maybe it's something like that where you're like, man, it's hard not to like this guy, and to put him now with all the full camps and everything to go together. It just sells it for me somehow.
And there's two more features to this which you have to take into consideration here. Number one, I think it's unprecedented in certain ways. For example, ESPN contacted us this morning. They're going to use that footage, 20 seconds of the footage from your interview with Diaz. In some ways, and McGregor was already on ESPN, as he mentioned, as everyone knows, this is playing out in the larger media in ways I'm not sure any MMA squabble has before. Now, there's been some between Dana White and Fighter, or Fighter and UFC, but not Fighter versus Fighter, with UFC also kind of a party to it and a witness to it at the same time. That's unprecedented territory. But we mentioned that when they put Diaz and McGregor together, what was so great about it as a last-minute substitute? It was that you got the baking soda and the vinegar. It was this chemical reaction. Well, it turns out this chemical reaction has peeled back the first layer of things and revealed this larger debate we're having about how guys get paid and what it means to get special treatment. And we're having real, sincere, honest conversations about the nature of star power and who gets promotional pushes. It's actually turned into something, to Jeff's point, which is why I think he likes it, something kind of substantive about it. And there's a really interesting thing going on.
And it only can happen in this fight. Because I think even though Nate Diaz's profile as a star in the sport has risen, I think most people would agree that star power is somewhat contingent upon his connection to Conor McGregor. And he's the guy that holds the key, because McGregor wants this rematch so much, and he's the big star. And so when he wants something that much, and the UFC wants to bring it to him, well, how are they going to get it? Well, they've got to get it through Nate Diaz.
And the chip on Nate Diaz's shoulder is really Conor McGregor. The whole treatment he's received. He was going on about Dennis Seaver and like, who's Dennis Seaver? What is all this about? They created this monster. Yes, that's what a promotion does. But his roundabout point is just, why haven't I got this love? Why haven't I not, got this stuff? But when he went into the rants about, Cowboy Cerrone and anybody who says, I'll fight for free, I mean, those are things that sort of transcend. You hear people say this all the time about, I'll fight for free, I'll fight this guy again, anywhere and all that. Diaz was saying, you know what, I would fight my rematches, the guys that I lost for free, but I want to be paid for any big fight that's going to make the company money. Any fight that you know what I'm saying? He just wants to be paid. I just felt like it, maybe it was just the order of what he was saying in a logical way, in his own way of explaining it, but somehow it translated, when he was saying all that stuff.
For the longest time, the rap on the Diaz brothers were that they were these thugs from the 209 and they brawl and things like that. But over time,
which is partly deserved.
But over time, we really do have to start giving them credit. And in particular, Nate, for the last few months, how he's played this whole situation. I mean, this guy is brilliant as far as negotiation is concerned. And I'm not just using that word. I mean, to me, the best, which I said yesterday, the best negotiators are the ones who are truly willing to walk away. They really, truly are ready and willing to walk away. He is ready and willing to walk away. And that's why he's okay with saying, give me this money. And I think that this is going to be, to your point, a real turning point in the history of this sport. People are now talking about multi-million-dollar fights and fighters getting that much money and not even laughing at it. Like, this is like, yeah, they should be getting this much. We've never been in a situation where both fighters are talking big, seven figures, 8 figures. We've never talked about that before. We would laugh at that sort of thing, or other people in the outside world would laugh at that sort of thing. And here you have both fighters, kind of playing off what you wrote in your article, both fighters with their squabbles towards the UFC, fighting for their own things, but at the end of the day, they're kind of fighting for the same thing, so they're on the same page, but not on the same page. But this to me, if I'm a fighter, I'm looking at this, I'll be like, yeah, you're right, Nate. This is the way I should be handling my career. You're 100% right. You're actually laying out the blueprint for everyone. You're giving us the playbook. Who would have ever thought we'd be talking about Nate Diaz in that regard?
But I think the brilliance, you use the word brilliant, and it's funny, we don't think of those guys that way, but today on the way in here, I was driving to the train station and I had NPR on, and there was a guy, it was a politician talking about world affairs, and I was sitting there listening to the guy, and I was realizing that he sounded very intelligent, and he was the British ambassador to the U.S., and he had an accent, not the kind of accent you'd hear at Old Trafford, but more the kind of accent you'd hear at Oxford, and a very learned sounding man. And so naturally I'm taking every word he puts out as something that's very, very important. We don't necessarily think of like Nate that way. We think of him as like a street guy, but when you really dissect the words that are coming out of his mouth and really listen, there's a lot of brilliance there. And the stuff that during your interview, like time and again, he would say something and I would jot that down, and then before I even finished writing those words down, he's saying something else, and it was really, really smart, astute. This is a guy who's not just a fighter. He's a guy who's a prize fighter, and I think I tweeted this out. He's a prize fighter looking for his prize, and that's really what these guys should be doing.
And it's not just brilliant, I guess, but like it's just his conviction, his principles. What he's basically saying is, hey, he made a good amount of money, but what was the word he used? Something like, that was just the money to catch up.
Reimbursement. That word has stuck with me the most.
It's an amazing way to look at it. You realize how he's looking at it is actually very bright, because he's still looking at like, hey, you owe me this. I didn't just make my career off this one fight. Now I'm where I'm at, so please open the floodgates.
Here's the truth about things real quick. The reimbursement word, as soon as I read that, I was like, who is Neil deGrasse Tyson? Forget him.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Talking about astrophysics. But the truth is, what this situation again has revealed to me is that there is a fault in the way in which UFC promotes stars. I'm not sure it's avoidable, but I'm glad Nate Diaz has pointed it out, which is to say there are certain people, and really this is true of corporate America generally, leadership are going to look down, they're going to try to identify talent, and they're going to push them through the channels that they know to be readily available. Someone like Conor McGregor makes that kind of easy. But there are also going to be people, because you asked him about the needle moving comment, and what he basically revealed was that he got passed over because I don't think he fit traditional models of how the UFC identified and pushed stars. But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy because he never really got that opportunity. And now that he has, turned it so fast into a raging blaze of something. Now, he needed Conor McGregor to do that, fair enough. But it just shows you that there are going to be guys who complain they don't get a push, and it's going to look like, well, maybe they shouldn't have. But that's only because they didn't fit the traditional models of how those guys get pushed.
Right, and also, that leading to from your statement, you might think, well, this is a problem for the UFC. They're going to have to pay these guys more, and that may be the case. If Nate Diaz gets his way, the UFC is going to have to pay out more money, but there's going to be a bigger pool of money because the media in general, the people who are not just the folks who are watching this show, but people who are like marginally interested in MMA, who watch SportsCenter and read SI.com, not the stuff I'm writing, but the stuff that's on the front page. Mm-hmm. Those guys are going to start paying attention because they've already paid attention to Rousey, they paid attention to McGregor. They start seeing a guy like Nate Diaz. That means more and more and more money generates for the UFC. And they're going to pay out a bigger portion of it if Nate demands it, but they're going to be making money hand over fist.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you mentioned the $2 million figure, which I think as of maybe a week ago before some of this stuff started happening, I would have probably said no, but it's funny how these things actually do promote a fight, I think.
Sure.
In the end, it just captivates your imagination. And I think when you see guys like Nate Diaz speaking the way he was, it just adds so much more to him. The people who are not really in him suddenly are going to listen to him a little bit more. It's a great combustible thing, like you put them together and wow, what happens now? And I feel like I want to see the full camps, I want to see the full lead up to that fight now.
Yeah, and anyone who thinks that this isn't all great for the UFC, think about this journey from, Conor's retirement to TMZ catching footage of Dana showing up at the hotel. Like, this is all build up for the fight, and it's going to be interesting because the fight isn't done. If the fight doesn't get made, it's somewhat all for naught, although I do think you can say that Conor's a bigger star now, Nate's a bigger star, so whatever happens to them next, they will still capitalize on all of this. But all this buildup, all this drama from day to day to day, I think just leads to a bigger pay-per-view number. Now, where does Floyd Mayweather play in all this? Where does he fit in all this? To me, there's two ways that you can look at the Floyd thing. First of all, here's Floyd Mayweather, who is on the outside looking in, which is amazing. He's 49-0 in boxing, yet there's no one really, there's no real dance partner for him right now. He's beaten all the top guys. His last pay-per-view did very poorly against Berto.
500,000.
Compared to what he had been doing.
Poorly.
Fair enough. The fight that everyone wants to see him in, Triple G, is not going to happen. So he's looking, all right, who's the biggest name in the fight world right now. It's Conor McGregor. So that says something in its own right, that he has to step outside his world. Conor takes the bait. He's happy to. He'll play along with the Instagram posts and all that. So that's one way of looking at it. If you notice, all these reports coming out about September 17th, you have Jalen Rose. That's a Floyd Mayweather guy. You have Floyd Mayweather admitting that he's the one starting these rumors. You don't see any credible boxing reporters talking about September 17th. Also,
in fact, you see Kevin Iole losing his mind over it.
Exactly.
Rightfully
These are the
so.
ones with the true sources. Also, if you've been following Mayweather for the last few years, he always fights in September and May. September and May. September and May. That's the time that he wants to fight. So he's putting this out there. He's doing it. Also, when you look at it from the flip side, when you see, a Colin Cowherd putting it out there, who all of a sudden is very chummy with Dana White and stuff, come on now. You don't think that they're trying to put pressure on Nate Diaz to take this fight? Oh, let's book our travel right now. It's happening. The fight is on September 17th. I got my hotel. Do you got your hotel? Come on, what is that? I mean, this is so transparent. And I love the fact that Nate's not falling for it. Conor's playing along, and power to him. It just raises his profile.
He should play along. I mean, of course.
No, Nate said, fight the fight. I'll take you. I'll take your bluff. Go fight Mayweather. Let's see how that works out for you. Yeah. I have no doubt that it would be a big deal if they could come to terms today. It would be gigantic. None of us would agree with that. We're all laughing at the idea that there are some people who think that it's on. Right. There are people who are saying to the world right now that fight is on. That's a lie. You are lying to the public.
Yeah, but if you repeat it enough, it becomes truth.
It's crazy to me.
Right?
Crazy stuff happens. I mean, it's ridiculous that something like that would happen, that would be even talked about. But man, who would have thought that the Republican Party would be putting Donald Trump up to run for president of the United States, right? I mean,
they actually resisted it the whole time. They couldn't stop them.
But now they couldn't stop them. So crazy stuff happens, and So I mean, I'm not going to say that's never going to happen. Crazy stuff happens.
Okay, so now here's the big question.
But to your point about Nate Diaz, right? I mean, how has he played this? What a master stroke. This guy turns out to be the most savvy self-promoter, again, not in ways that Conor McGregor would do it necessarily. In fact, not even ways like Ronda Rousey would do it. Ronda Rousey accepted the wave of mainstream attention coming her way. Nate Diaz has gone about a very sort of circuitous route about it on the outside, and then coming back in certain ways and saying just sort of a knowledge of the fight game, to your point, calling a bluff. You only do that if you really understand how the game is played, both in terms of the media and in terms of contracts and how this operation really works. That's a veteran move that he's pulling, and it's a very smart one to do.
So do we think that the fight is going to happen, though? You know what I mean? Like, because right now, they're not, they're not even close. I mean, as you said, yes.
You mean
Diaz and McGregor.
Sorry, I was asking about McGregor. I was about to fire you.
My apologies.
I can't even fire you, but I would try.
I would have walked out of this room for asking that question.
Why would you think that it wouldn't? Other than, I mean,
he is asking for money. The UFC doesn't want to pay a lot. I mean, look, he confirmed yesterday that Dana walked out, was sort of upset, but that they ended it on a somewhat positive note, going to visit his mural in Stockton. But at the end of the day, there is an offer on the table, and at least one side of the equation isn't taking the offer right now. Do they have to do everything in their power to get this fight done? Because let's be honest, Conor McGregor fights someone else in August, or even waits to the winner of Frankie and Aldo, or fights someone at 155. Who knows? It's still a big deal. No one's doubting that. It's not maybe as big as this because you have the two big names. Do they have to get this done? Does it get done? That's what I'm asking.
But we're assuming that we're putting out the proposition that the whole thing pivots on the UFC. In some ways, it might pivot more on Conor McGregor. Who wants this fight more than anybody?
Yeah.
Does Dana White want this fight more than Conor McGregor is? I don't think so. I think McGregor, this is, so maybe part of, Nate gets paid because Conor, because the UFC pulls a little bit, maybe McGregor uses his power, or even, throws a little bit back into the pot. I mean, I'm not going to say that he's going to throw money back in that. That's probably a little crazy, but he wants this more than anybody. He's more than anybody in the entire world, probably. I don't think that the fans haven't been clamoring for it. The UFC wasn't clamoring for it. Nate Diaz wasn't.
I think, though, now that sentiment has changed a little bit. I think a lot of fans would like to see it.
Came around to it, right?
Yeah.
That's what I felt like, too. Like you were mentioning off the top. I mean, I feel like a lot of people came around to the idea, first of all.
Especially on a mainstream level, right?
Yeah, and on the mainstream, it was booked for one thing, and then it was off. And suddenly when it's off, everybody wants it. It's one of those types of things. I think it still gets done, but I do believe Diaz when he says that, like you were saying about negotiations, that he would just walk away from it. I think it really just comes down to them solving that dilemma. But I feel like they will at some point. They're gonna. I feel like they'll reach something.
Is it a letdown? Is it almost boxing-esque if they can't get it done, like dangling this carrot?
Very boxing-esque if they can't get it done. But I'm stranger things have happened. I feel confident they'll get it done. I think Nate wants it because I think it's a great payday.
Sure.
Obviously, I'm sure he likes his chances. We all know McGregor wants it. There's not difficult to figure out that UFC wants it. He's not going to take it for what he thinks is a bus pass fare. But he's going to. I would be surprised if that eventually they'll make it. Now, when they make it, I don't know.
Yeah, and again, playing off of what we talked about last week, he even asked me yesterday, like, what else makes sense for me? And I was like, well, how about a title shot? And right away, boom. F the belt. Yeah, what does the belt mean? I mean, again, here we are in 2016, and the biggest names aren't clamoring for the belt. That's a huge shift in the way people view.
He was one of the leaders to start that thing, right? Like, it was, what was he saying? That's a fairy tale. Yeah.
Well, the heavyweight champion of the UFC, how about that transition? Let's move along. Stipe Miocic yesterday in Cleveland, during the Cavs-Raptors Game 5, tremendous game, by the way. It was very close, hotly contested.
I heard that Canadian team did really well.
Yeah, it was. What a joy it was watching that game.
Oh, man.
Jurassic Park was all smiles.
Yes.
Somebody from Canada has to make the playoffs.
Yeah, right.
Hey, we're doing just fine. Canada invented the game, by the way, James Naismith, but we can talk about that a different day. So they announced that Cleveland's own Stipe Miocic, the pride of Cleveland, the darling that is Stipe Miocic in Cleveland. They announced that his first title defense is going to be September 10th at the Q in Cleveland against Alistair Overeem. And again, we were talking about this for 198. Like, that card was perfect for that market. Finally, it's like you look at some of these fights over the last few years, like Dominic Cruz. Did we talk about this last week? Dominic
Cruz.
Why did that happen in Boston, right?
Right.
Here we are, not laying out our schedule for the entire year and saying, all right, we have an opening in, Florida. Stipe, you're going to go defend your title there because we have to fill up a card. No, the UFC is, because let's be honest, they probably didn't have this day booked if Stipe loses to Verdum, right? But here they are and say, wow, Stipe's a big deal. Let's get this done. There's an opening in September. We booked the title fight. This, to me, feels very boxing-esque. This is what boxing does all the time. This is why Lucien Boutte always fights in Montreal, or Jean Pascal always fights in Montreal. That's what they do. This is not what the UFC has been doing over the past few years. They take the big fight to Vegas, or they just plug holes. This gets me very excited. That's my point on all of it.
Why does it get you excited?
Because this is the way fights should be booked. Big local draw, goes home, fights in front of his people, sells out in 10 minutes. That's the way it should be booked.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, why, you disagree with this?
I don't disagree with it, but let me just play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
They put Kane in Mexico. They put Verdum in Curitiba.
Both did great.
Title defenses. Both did great, but is this new?
It's not. It has not been the norm.
Yes,
it has not been the norm. I'm not saying it's new, but it's not the norm. I mean,
also both those guys lost in their own time.
That's true.
Mexico City, like when you think about like Mexico City, they've been trying to get in there for a long time. We had heard about that, and then Brazil, they'd had a presence down there. It feels like those things were just part of a broader scheme. This is something very tailor-made. The Cleveland, which I feel like would have never been on their radar, really. It's
why Why hasn't Daniel Cormier defended the title in Louisiana, in New Orleans? Why didn't Holly Holm fight in Albuquerque in her first title defense? Why couldn't they figure that out? You know what I mean? When you have these draws that are big deals in their local communities, you have to figure out a way to get them to fight there, because look at what happened with Conor. You brought Conor, maybe it was a little before becoming champion, you brought him to Dublin, and what that did was, in the eyes of the world, made him, in my opinion, into a bigger deal, right? When you see the hero's welcome, to me it's a much bigger deal, and it means more than seeing that welcome to a mixed reaction at best in Vegas, where they're a little bit of a lukewarm crowd for the most part. Stipe Miocic is going to feel like a superstar come September 10th. He is going to get the red carpet treatment leading up. He is going to get the biggest pop. This is a guy who has, to your point before the fight, not been great in front of the media. Now look at him. He's thriving and doing little things, coming out with the belt. But now, don't you feel a little differently about Stipe? Doesn't he have that sort of aura? He does to me now. He has that championship swag, if you will.
Already, because of the way that Cleveland has treated him already. Just the fact that they would announce this fight during a Cavs playoff game, that's a huge deal. Just think about that. This is the NBA, right? This is the NBA. This is LeBron James's game. This is not just some mid-season game that doesn't mean anything. This is a big deal, and that they announced that in that arena. That was the first announcement. That was a brilliant move, I thought. And then the Cavs, the Indians, and let's see, and also the Browns. They all had some kind of reaction to it that came out over social media. It's just really a great hometown hero story that I don't know that there's any other athlete in the UFC that really could command that. Maybe Holly Holm in Albuquerque would have been the closest thing I could think of. I mean,
she's probably bigger.
She's
probably bigger.
The big fight.
Big enough, right?
Yeah.
The big fights coming to Madison Square Garden. Yeah. We've heard people talk about, well, Frankie Edgar's going to maybe fight there, or John Jones. John Jones is not a bigger star in Madison Square Garden than he is. John Jones is a huge star, but the fact that you bring him to the Garden, he's an upstate guy. He's not a New York City guy. Frankie's a big star, but this is a huge deal. Cleveland is starved for a champion. They have a champion now, and to then have him pace around with his championship belt is brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I like it too. I for all the same reasons you mentioned, 52 years in the making to have a champion. Now, I know it's not one of the major sports, but it's a funny little niche, right, to say, like, we have a champion suddenly and all those teams are behind this guy, and you're saying, like, well, our champion is going to now perform here. I mean, there's something very cool about that, just saying, like, we're going to embrace this guy as a city icon too, as like a part of our city, is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I felt like I was hoping they might do something like that, but then again, you look at what you were mentioning with Kane, going to Mexico City, losing to Verdum going to Brazil and losing to Miocic, and now you're like, okay, now his job is to uphold it and give them something to cheer about rather than turn it into a silent tomb.
There's a bit of a small benefit to it that it's not the biggest thing in the world, but it kind of matters when you think about it. So I lived through MMA in DC when Mike Easton was coming up.
Oh, yes.
Which was when Demetrius Johnson fought Dominic Cruz.
Yep.
Mike Easton made his debut in the UFC on that card against Byron Bloodworth, I believe. Okay.
UFC on Versus 6.
Yes.
October 1st, 2011.
In the Verizon Center, where the Wizards are not playing right now.
And I believe the Capitals, or did they make it?
Drop dead.
Okay.
All right. Here's the truth, though. When the UFC can grab onto people like that, and Easton had a bit of a name in DC prior to that, nothing like Stipe,
right.
But similar.
Sure.
What winds up happening is you get access to certain media you didn't get access to.
Yeah.
Typically, the MMA media is covering MMA, and then these sort of high-level national outlets, and everything in these regional outlets in between, like the Washington Post in DC, like CSN in Washington, they won't touch it unless there's a local hook. The second benefit you get is, I remember after that DC event, there was a lot of attention on MMA's local gyms. All the local gyms got a major benefit from it. So I'm not saying this is the biggest deal in the world, but it's something to consider. What Stipe will do, not just for a great event, is he may raise the profile of the MMA scene in Cleveland generally for Clevelanders.
Yeah, that is actually a great point, because you think people are going to do these ancillary stories on the local news. You see that all the time.
When is MMA on your local news?
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah, I think actually the impact will be even greater nationally because of the kind of scene we can expect to see at that arena when Stipe comes out. I mean, I don't expect it to be the same mania that we saw over in Dublin when McGregor came out, but just think about that. Think not the fight that he actually put on, but think about the scene in that building and what it was like. And you still talk about it. It was, and I remember that weekend we were down in Atlantic City watching some really good fights. But it wasn't that scene in Dublin. So now Cleveland is going to that Cleveland arena when ESPN does its highlight show that night. They're not going to just show the fight. They're going to be showing all the mania in the building, and that's going to give the sport a bigger profile.
I just like when the UFC takes a fight and puts it in the best market possible for that fight. It's and I know that Weidman couldn't defend the title in New York because it was illegal, but the fact that he has never fought on the East Coast, even as UFC champion or as contender, to me is crazy. Frankie Edgar never defended the title, and when's the last time Frankie fought in Jersey? They have to do that more, in my opinion. And I know Vegas is the home base, and you can sell a lot of tickets there, and you can charge a lot for those tickets. But sometimes when you have these guys who may not necessarily be the biggest draw to put on a Memorial Day weekend card or whatever, Miocic isn't the biggest draw nationally, but you put him in that in that setting, he becomes a big deal. He looks like a big deal, and then I think there's a trickle-down effect, and then you have an even bigger star in your hands.
Maybe they broke the seal. Maybe by the time they have that, the Cavaliers will also be the NBA champions. You just never know. You never know the psychological effect on the city.
What are you trying to say? I mean, the series isn't over. Bro, there's Game 6 tomorrow night, all right? We the North.
Oh, God. I was just going to say real quickly, I mean, obviously, look, the UFC may be selling for $4 billion in a matter of weeks or months, so they obviously have done really well. But I think it also speaks to, and when I say this, I don't mean this as a slight. However, there has been a decline in the ability for UFC to go, we're going to show up to a town, and we're just going to have a UFC show with these disembodied characters from the local community, and it will sell. Which isn't to say they can't still do that, but I think they're also looking for angles when they don't necessarily have to.
Right, absolutely. Okay, let's move along. Let's talk about the BJ Penn news this week. Unfortunate news. We've been talking about BJ for quite some time now. His fight went from happening early March, then we thought it was going to happen end of April, then we thought it was going to happen first week of June, and now it's not happening first week of June, and we don't know.
I also like how we've gone from BJ Penn versus Dennis Seaver to Cole Miller versus Alex Caceres.
Amazing. Same fight, yeah. Unbelievable. So it comes out a couple of days ago that he had voluntarily admitted to USADA back in March that he had taken an IV, and 2 months later, here we are getting the word that he is out of the fight because IVs 365 days a year. If you don't have a TUE, a therapeutic use exemption, you cannot take the IV. Now, it's unclear how long he's going to be out for, if he's going to appeal. He did a quick interview with a local news channel saying that he was unaware that he couldn't take it 365 days. And Jeff Nowitzki of the UFC told the Las Vegas Review-Journal that he couldn't speak specifically about this story, but he did say that in a case like this, an athlete can ask for a retroactive TUE, and there's a whole process involved there where he has to get documentation from his doctor, the one who administered the IV, and then there's a TUE committee, as he put it, that has to look over the case and see that, decide whether or not it was in fact needed medically, if he did in fact need a TUE for this, and that process can take a couple of months, and that's why a lot of people were wondering, like, why did it take 2 months for this to come out? Well, he was sort of hinting that that's why. That makes sense. To me, the question is, though, like, all right, all these stops and starts, there's been ups and downs. Already people were sort of lukewarm about the idea of BJ coming back. Is this kind of the end? Or do you foresee him fighting through this and eventually fighting again?
Yeah, he'll fight again.
You think so?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no guarantee, I suppose. Really, it's very contingent upon what happens with this retroactive TUE, if that's in fact what he is pursuing.
To be clear, what he said about the retroactive TUE was that would delay them coming out with the provisional suspension.
Sure.
But now that they've come out with it, it's clear that the committee has sort of poo-pooed that idea. You get what I'm saying?
Right. Well, we don't really know what's happening in full detail with his situation, whether he provided appropriate documentation or whether he didn't, or whether there's a case for any kind of quick reinstatement or not. I guess we'll have to wait and see. I suspect, well, I don't know if I can, how do I say this exactly? If I had to wager, I would wager he'd be back in probably by 2016, maybe first or second quarter 2017.
Not getting younger.
Nope. He's already. That ship has already sailed. But for me, I don't mind that they removed him. There is. I'll be the first to admit. Like, you can say that he had a responsibility to know what was allowed of him and what wasn't, even if there is a legitimate medical need that he had to use this for. What I would say, though, is, to me, you have guys like USADA is like one of these sort of not nefarious exactly, but these these clandestine operations to get you, and you've got UFC fighters literally like writing down and admitting this thing because they don't even realize they're making infractions. Whose fault is that? Of course it's their own, no doubt about it. And even if there is nothing wrong with what he's doing, that should be noted. However, my last point about this is, to me, it's not a coincidence you've got fighters like Lyoto Machida, like BJ Penn, literally saying what they've done wrong because they have no idea what's on there, because the fighters, even in an advisory, non-voting capacity, had no say in what the rules were going to be. That, to me, is not, the learning curve is just going to take longer as a consequence.
So do you sympathize with him, though? Like, let's say we believe that he didn't know. Do you sympathize with a guy who's been in the sport since, late 90s, right? That was a completely different era. He's been out of the game. Should there be more of a learning curve?
I mean, I sympathize with him in the sense that I probably wouldn't put him in the same boat as I put some guy who's been juicing.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not sure whether that's even a legitimate way of sympathizing. It's, I'll just say this: I think that the lesson I take away from this, and I think maybe that the lesson the sport should take away, is that these guys need an education. They need to be somehow. It's not just enough to say, here are our rules, and okay, guys, go ahead, go fight.
Sure.
I think there has to be a little bit more. They have these fighter summits and all these things out. The UFC has. I don't know what they're covering there. I'm not sure whether BJ Penn was at the last one, but it would be great if there were some way to make it a little clearer, not necessarily to the fighter himself, but also the fighter's representatives, just so that everybody knows exactly what's expected. Because look, if he was trying to get away with it, he wouldn't have been admitting it in pre-fight. He would have tried to hide it. So he clearly didn't know what he was, or I'm going to assume that he did not know whether this was allowed or not allowed. He should. He has an obligation to know that, and he should have known that. But I think there's also an obligation on the UFC's part and USADA's part to educate these guys.
I want to take him at his word. I mean, like you mentioned, he's been fighting for a long time. He's probably been able to do that stuff, going back. And last time he fought, he was able to do that. He was able to take the. But he's now, like, if he's in Albuquerque, there's so many UFC fighters around him. It's a little baffling to think that people wouldn't have this discussion. Like people
Unless this happens in a private medical context.
That's true. But I mean, I just feel like even in this case, I'm like, you've been around the sport long enough and you've been around other pro fighters long enough where it seems like you should know these types of things. But I still want to give him the benefit of the doubt. I just think that there's a little bit of he's starting to get into that terrain of the Vitor Belforts for me. Those guys that you're just like, man, is the juice worth the squeeze after all?
Right.
Like each time you get revved up or your mind around him coming back or whatever it's going to happen, I feel like we're just dealt another curveball, and you know what I mean? It's just it gets so complicated with BJ Penn. I hope for his sake, because I know fighting is good for him. I know we've talked about this a little bit, like good for him to have something to focus on, given his other problems and everything else. I think he will fight again for that reason, but I hope he can sort of get himself straightened out and follow the rules.
I think the unfortunate part is I've gone on the record on this show saying that I was in favor of this comeback because of who he was aligned with, because he was with Greg Jackson and Greg Jackson was giving him the stamp of approval and saying that we can get this done. Now I wonder, and I've tried to reach out to him, but to no avail, and I get it. I've tried to reach out to the team as well, and they've said that he's still sort of weighing things, although I did notice that Israel Martinez, his wrestling coach, tweeted out a picture of them together yesterday in Albuquerque, so it's clear that he's still there. But to me, I was looking forward to June 4th to seeing if Greg could reinvent BJ, and also you kind of, at least for me, like I viewed it as the end of this training camp that he had been on in Albuquerque, away from Hilo, because this is not a guy who is, this is not an Albuquerque guy. He was not uprooting his family and moving to Albuquerque. So you have to think that he was excited to go back home and get back to his normal life when this journey was done. Now, this thing is sort of in the air. Does he stay in Albuquerque? This is why I wonder if he actually ever fights again, because is he willing to just keep lingering in Albuquerque and being away from his family? That's a hard thing to do for a guy like BJ Penn. So the timing, I think, has to be devastating. Also, it's the third time that this comeback fight has been delayed. Mentally, that has to be exhausting.
He won in March originally.
He won in March, yeah.
So that's the whole Nick Lentz, going back to that whole thing. It was like that was the circle.
So going back to your point, it went from BJ versus Nick Lentz to BJ versus Dennis Seaver to BJ versus Cole Miller to Alex Caceres versus Cole Miller. Hopefully nothing changes between now and June 4th.
Yeah, I'll just say, I'll add to this. I don't know about the BJ Penn personal life story. I don't too far removed to really know whether this is the end. It seems like a reasonable concern. This is sure a lot to ask from independent contractors, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it goes back to the collective bargaining.
Sure is, isn't it? Like, to your point, you have the Jackson team, which has any number of resources to rebuild him as a fighter and as a competitor and as an athlete. And they don't have the resources to manage everyone at the granular level about these guys' lives. They're adults. And to your point, without like a real hands-on education experience, you can just see what people are just falling through the cracks. Is it the end of the world? Maybe for BJ, I don't know for the UFC, but sure is unfortunate. If this was avoidable, it's very unfortunate.
Yeah, a memo came out last week about these new weight cutting rules that they have to come in at,
Again,
X
sure
percent.
is a lot to ask from independent contractors.
That's something that is quintessentially something that would be collectively bargained. Okay, you say 8%, we say 10%. This is what happens in sports.
Right.
I think most people in other sports would agree it's a healthy part of the sport, the back and forth. finding a middle ground. Look at what's happening in the NBA with this new television contract. They're expecting record salaries, come free agency in July. So, yeah, that is definitely a point worth noting. Let's move along to another guy who's, I think, attempting a comeback. Our old friend Chael Sonnen. His suspension comes up in July, 2-year suspension. And wow, I don't know about you guys, but I thought on Monday that was the beginning of the comeback. I thought him talking about George St. Pierre and basically clean and showing off the guns. I mean, that was Chael telling the world that in less than 2 months I am a free man and I am planning on coming back. Do you think that there is an appetite for that after what happened, him getting suspended, and he did eventually come clean with everything? Do you think the public wants to see Chael back? And if you guys agree with that sentiment, is the George St. Pierre fight, is that a fight that interests you?
I would say that I think he comes back. I think that is like you're saying, but I don't think that the enthusiasm will be the same. First of all, he's kept himself very much in the public eye with his multiple platforms on ESPN and his own podcast and everything. His mystery, I guess, is not really there. Like the things that he was really known for have almost gone to other guys now. Like Conor McGregor, who has just become the guy that people are compelled to hear what he's going to say. I don't think he lost it completely, though. I think there is a lot of there's something about Chael Sonnen that you want to watch, and he is in that league of guys where you could do fun fights at this point, and I don't think he's going to go for a title run or anything like that. So when he was mentioning his whole thing, which Chael always thinking ahead, mentioning the whole GSP, putting it on him, he beat me and all this stuff. Who knows what really went on? I could see that type of fight. I could see him having those types of fights and them being a lot of fun. I just don't think he's ever going to be the same scale, only because he's been around the whole time. And I feel like people back in the day didn't know how to take Chael Sonnen. They were like, "Wow, what is this guy? Who is it?" It caught us off guard for like a year. We were just riding that whole like, "Wow, this is crazy phenomenon," But that's sort of passed, I think. So I still think he has enough of a star, and he's smart enough to make something of it, though.
Yeah, I think that's what you said about people not knowing what to make of the guy. It's like Chael Sonnen, when he came out and started talking, it was almost as though he brought color TV to the black and white TV world of MMA. All of a sudden, everything was a little more colorful, a little more.
Look at Anderson.
But now, Conor McGregor came along and took the color TV and turned it into high def TV. And so, when Sonnen comes back, if he does, and I would kind of agree with you that he probably will, it's not going to be quite the spectacle that it was before, because we have Conor McGregor doing it at a higher level, in a more poetic level, I would say.
But don't you think in sports, and in particular combat sports, distance makes the heart grow fonder? I know he's been out there, but people tend to get excited when someone comes back from a long layoff.
Yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that he's not going to draw some excitement. I just think he's not going to be the new flavor that everybody is.
Sure.
Nobody's
the star
seen.
of the OC at that point,
Yeah.
I mean, so I can't imagine him going near that again. That's all I'm saying.
But do you think that there is an appetite? Like, will this be a big deal? Like, can he main event shows? Is he a big deal?
Maybe like a Fox Sports show, maybe a place on pay-per-view. It really depends on a few things. I think Chuck's right. There was a certain novelty to it, and the novelty has worn off. But that can be somewhat recaptured to the extent he can find a foil, right? Sure. And to the extent not only can he find a foil, but what does that mean to find one? It means that you not only have this sort of antagonism and magnetism at the same time with them, but also that people have some kind of realistic assessment of your chances being legitimate, right? They think you can maybe get this one done. Remember, he called Anderson Silva and beat him for 4.5 rounds and lost. You'd say, okay, in the rematch, I still pick Anderson Silva to win, but hey, this is a guy who got his ass kicked for 20 plus minutes. It's not exactly clear who he can do that with. To your point, I'm not discounting the possibility, but I think it's a clear downgrade from the level it was before. But again, Chael has pulled a rabbit out of a hat, so we'll see.
And he's fought, you look at his resume, the last few guys, he's fought Anderson Silva, John Jones, which was kind of crazy. He fought Rashad Evans. You know what I mean? And he's fighting these guys that were at the top, or hovering near the top, and I think he lost 3 of his last 4 or something like that. It wasn't like he left, when he went away, he had won 4 in a row, and we're sitting there thinking like, wow, who is this guy got left? So a part of that was he was already on his downward trajectory in competition. It was almost where he was when he came up, because before then, he was kind of a journeyman before Okami and all those, Nate Marquardt and all those. He was just been kind of a journeyman. People weren't talking about Chael Sonnen. It was like he just came out of nowhere. So unless he's got some crazy trick up his sleeve for this comeback, I can't imagine it. But I will say, if he fights George St. Pierre, it would be that would obviously be the most compelling scenario for him. other than maybe Vitor Belfort. I'm not sure about that, but
I was gonna say I don't think George takes the bait. It doesn't seem like the fight. I mean, let's not forget he's a 185er and a pretty big one, and George is a 170 pounder. I don't think George takes the bait, but I feel like a Vitor fight, even though Vitor looked pretty bad against Jacare, I still feel like that sells. Given their history, you could play clips from 5 years ago of Chael poking Vitor. And now, I think that there is something to be said about USADA Chael. Like, you know, like I actually want to see how he performs in this era. Now I know he's older and he's been out, but there are a few stars in this sport, and he's still a star. I mean, I still see the way people react to him. I think if he comes out and goes on the offensive towards Vitor.
One of these Las Vegas shows this year, it was maybe in September, maybe in January, so whenever they were out there when I was there. But I saw a line for him. He was just sitting there at the weigh-ins for ESPN, and there was a huge line for him, and I was thinking, that guy's still a star.
Yeah, Vitor would be a better foil than George, because I don't know George would react to him. I'm not sure how Vitor would react to him either, but Vitor just speaking on his own sometimes becomes, you know, can generate that villain thing anyway. So Chael goes from being the bad guy to being the good guy. There's a lot of moving parts there, and I think that would be a real interesting.
Red tape around that fight.
If I'm Vitor, I actually try to campaign for the fight, because I don't think there are many more compelling fights for him right now at 185 or in his career in general. So I do think he comes back. I think that was his way of telling people it's coming and expect more. And I think he comes back, you know, relatively soon.
The Little Nog fight, though.
The Little Nog as well.
It's funny, but that's the kind of fight. Yeah, that's the kind of fight that you think like, well, that sort of does make sense. Kind of going back to when they was the feeding the buses, the carrots and stuff. I mean, that whole thing. So that's the good thing about him. He was the original Conor McGregor in that he just upset everybody at once, and then
he was always like 5 fights ahead, right?
Exactly. So he could always then go back to that guy and get the match, you know.
Okay, I want to quickly ask you guys about this Venator FC card that played out last Saturday in Milan, Italy. And my main question is, okay, they have this middleweight title fight between former UFC fighter Luke Barnett and former UFC fighter and former MTV star Mayhem Miller. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of Jason Mayhem Miller, but was once a very big deal in this sport. And
is that the guy that got barfed on in that Paul Blart movie?
Did he?
And so it wasn't Paul Blart, but it was the same.
Here Comes the Boom.
Yeah.
Did he get barfed on? Interesting.
He did get. You didn't see that?
Lucky.
I did, but I don't. Lucky Patrick. I have the jersey somewhere right over there.
He got barfed on.
So he's booked in this fight. He had not fought for 4 years. Obviously has been going through a lot of personal issues, and the Venator, you know, promotion comes out. They have a very brash promoter, and he puts out funny press releases and all that. But we get to the weigh-ins, and this is a very serious question. We get to the weigh-ins, and he is 24 pounds overweight. And they come up with this strange concept of him having to hit, you know, 205 and then not being over 207 the morning of the fight and all that. And I was just curious. Like I was uncomfortable with the idea of Mayhem Miller fighting, coming in 24 pounds overweight, and then sort of not being forced to fight. But I feel like, and maybe I'm giving promoters too much credit, like you see that scenario, you're like, all right, man, like maybe we should just cut our losses here. And did you guys feel the same way? Could that have been, and you see the way he fought, that wasn't Mayhem of old. And I know he had been out for 4 years, but like he clearly wasn't himself. That was a serious thing, right? I mean, that
is himself. Like that's the thing. There's a part of me that doesn't want to see him fight anymore, because I feel like he's went down some dark alley that I'm like, well, I mean, but you know, I know he's a fighter, I get it, but I mean, like just this whole thing. I mean, I don't know if he was joking or not, but when they were originally talking about Barnett, he was like, you know, Josh Barnett, all this stuff. I mean. But you never know with him. He's always been that guy. You're like, how serious is the shtick, and how far does it actually go down some crazy path of, you know, his mind that you're seeing him get in trouble with the law and everything else. So in general, I didn't really want to see him take a fight. But seeing that, and especially, I know that the like you're mentioning that the promoter had been out there really saying like, hey guys, you got to give him a second chance, all this stuff. But for him to come in and you know, unprofessional and everything else to go into that sort of thing, I would have. I mean, if I'm the promoter, I say like, hey man, sorry, but this fight's not happening. Right. That's what I would have liked to have seen. I was kind of surprised that they did.
They rearranged all these fights.
I mean, it's surprising how far they bent to Jason Mayhem Miller.
I thought the way the Mayhem came to the weigh-ins was totally appropriate for that promotion. I was the only thing that disappointed me about the whole thing was that they managed to somehow salvage the card. I felt, you know, bringing Mayhem in there, knowing all the mental stuff that's been going on with him, and you know, and you know that they really didn't have any kind of examination with that guy. You know that they just booked him. They got Paul Harris in there, another guy who's been kind of banished from from any kind of
While on suspension.
Yeah.
legitimate, promotions. They bring him in there as well. That was the one disappointing.
And that one backfired as well.
Yeah.
Well, in a way, yeah. And the disappointing thing for me was that they managed to salvage the card, because I felt like that was everything blowing up in their faces was the appropriate thing, I felt, for that promotion. I didn't watch the fights, by the way, because why bother
Right.
watching those?
Yeah, I saw those two. Yeah, it was gross. It was gross and unethical. I'm not a doctor. I don't know exactly what troubles him. I mean, anecdotally, I hear things from people who either were close to him at one point who, say certain things. But I remember this debate. So I don't know exactly what's wrong with him and what can be done to fix him. But this debate recurs constantly. And this debate is people, these regional promoters. I remember this. We had this with Junie Browning one time, years ago. People were like, these promoters are giving these troubled guys a second chance, which to me is just a totally bankrupt argument. These promoters, particularly one in Italy, look, I get why he's booking Mayhem Miller. It's in his interest to book Mayhem Miller. It's in his interest to book Mayhem Miller when Mayhem Miller misses weight by double-digit pounds. Like, I get why he's doing it. And trying to make this argument to him that he shouldn't do it, it's not in his financial interest.
Right.
This is why you need another mechanism to regulate them, because on their own, they're just not going to do this sort of thing. And in a way, I sort of just get it. However, the fans should not be so naive to buy this nonsense when people say, well, these promoters are really giving him a second chance. There's no such thing. They are out there to make money off of these guys. Whether they are sick, whether they are injured, who knows what kind of medicals are really done for this? Who knows whether, if given a real psychological evaluation, we would say this guy is fit to even have a license to compete, which I know in Italy is not a relevant concern.
Right.
But I just mean the people that try to ascribe this nobility to promoters about giving people the opportunity to have these hero tales, you are kidding yourself. That is not what this is about. This is a money-making operation, no more, no less.
I will say on a personal note, it legitimately breaks my heart to see what has happened to Mayhem Miller, because there was a time where he was one of the most pleasant and smartest fighters that I've ever come across. I mean, again, I said this on my podcast several years ago. When I was applying for a green card to work here in the United States, I had to apply to get, a green card. I forget what the term is, but you have to sort of prove to the American government that you have, extraordinary ability. That's the term that they use, and you have to get peers and people that you work with to sort of vouch for you.
So you had Mayhem lie for you?
No. But in all honesty, this is a few years ago, I had to find a fighter who I've covered and ask him to go to bat. And I went to Mayhem Miller. I mean, think about that.
Yeah.
I went to Mayhem Miller. Of all the fighters, all the people that I knew in the fight game, I went to him because I knew he was a very smart guy.
That takes my wife has a green card. That takes a tremendous amount of trust.
Yeah, I went to him, and I remember texting him and him saying absolutely. And I'm not one to ask for favors, especially from people that you cover. It's an uncomfortable thing, but you develop relationships with people. This is not the same guy. And again, we can't play doctor here, but with all this talk about CTEs and things like that, I wish there was someone who would almost take him by the hand and really truly figure out. He used to have a guy by the name of Ryan Parsons in his corner, and Ryan was like a father figure to him. And they had a falling out, but Ryan took care of him. And I wish that Mayhem had that. I wish that he had it. To me, it actually hurts my heart to see what has happened to him. I don't want to see this happen. I don't want this Mayhem.
And it could get, sadly, it could get worse.
Yeah, I don't want to see it get worse. Mayhem Miller, think about Mayhem Miller. Mayhem Miller had a show on MTV when MTV was MTV. Not that long ago, and he wasn't in the UFC. He wasn't a UFC star.
Right.
You know what I mean? He was once in the UFC, but it wasn't because of his time in the UFC that he had that show. He was a major, major figure.
He was good on that show.
He was great.
The show itself was kind of a goofy thing, but he was really entertaining and did it very well. You know, he seemed like a professional.
I was listening to an interview on it was the Joe Rogan podcast. It was Mayhem on the Joe Rogan podcast. It was when the whole thing with Nick Diaz was happening, the brawl. And he's talking about the brawl and if the fight's going to happen. And he just sounds like a completely different person. He is a different human being.
He used to write columns, too, for different
That's
magazines.
right, yeah.
And they were really, they were very much written in his style, but there was always a nugget of wisdom. He was well liked by his peers. He was tough. He was durable. Rampage liked him.
Yeah.
He was entertaining and connected to all different kinds of demos in the MMA world. Older veterans, young guys, grapplers, strikers. I'm not sure what to say about it.
It hurts.
You've got a photo right over here on your wall where it's
That-
like one of the classic shots where
Sakuraba.
It is my
Sakuraba.
favorite MMA
He's
photo
praying
ever.
over. I mean,
taken
that's the
by
guy
Esther
that
Lin.
you think about. That guy, you know, that's what I remember during his whole run with Strikeforce and everything else. So it's,
He was seconds away from subbing Jake Shields.
On CBS.
Yeah, I know.
Remember they cut the commercial, rear naked choke. It was amazing.
But you know, I guess when did it all start badly for him? I don't know to what extent it's performance related or mental health related or some combo of the two. But when after he did the loss to Michael Bisping, it just was.
To me, it was the
a
CB
descent.
Dalloway fight. Remember, he
Think so?
comes out and says, "I will retire." He says, "I will retire if I lose to CB Dalloway, UFC 146." And then apparently there was some issue backstage, and then he retires, and he's heartbroken. And from there, it all changed. And that was his last fight prior to this Saturday. Two more quick topics before we go. Want to ask you guys quickly about a topic that you love, near and dear to your heart, PVZ, Paige VanZant. You know, some behind the scenes for all you viewers at home. Almost every single week, as I send out the topics for this show, I've always included Paige VanZant on Dancing with the Stars. For whatever reason, we have never gotten to this topic. It's almost like our Matt Damon on the Jimmy Kimmel show. We always sort of did, yeah, we never got to it. But today we are going to get to it because she came in second, the show is wrapped up, and I know last night she tweeted, "I'm coming home to the UFC." Yeah. But Paige VanZant made a lot of money being on that show. She is a much bigger star in the world.
Good Morning America, just like.
Good Morning America. She is going to be in the remake of Kickboxer, or the sequel.
Wow.
I mean, this says...
Straight to DVD.
Straight to DVD. But should Paige VanZant fight again?
Yeah, how old is she? 21?
I know, but if she's this big of a deal, why go back to making 60 and 60?
I mean, as long as she's getting kickboxing offers straight to DVD nubs, I wouldn't be rolling out in the UFC too quickly.
Okay, crazier question: is Paige VanZant that much of a bigger deal? Like, are you hearing people? I have friends whose wives have said to me, like, "Have you ever talked to this Paige girl before?"
Yeah,
and I'm like, "Yeah."
My sister hit me up. My sister could not possibly give an F less about MMA, watched the show, saw her and was like, that girl's a fighter.
Yeah.
So I think there's a potential, but I guess it just depends on what offers come her way. I don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the bottom line. She has said that she wants to come back, and because fighting is something that's important to her. And she's young enough that she can get better, and who knows where that ceiling is for her. But we also don't know where the ceiling is for her in terms of using her star power. You know, she's doing this straight to DVD type film now.
Well, I don't know if it's straight to DVD,
but she
This
might.
is how rumors start.
It's going to be 2% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes. I guarantee
Luke
it.
gave a good review on it for straight. But no, she's doing that now. She might be. It might lead to something a little bit bigger. We've seen how some of the other athletes, Ronda Rousey and others, will they'll be in a movie and then they sort of get to their level of where their star power goes. We don't know whether she's a good actress. She certainly has that the Hollywood appeal, and if that propels her, more power to her.
For the record, I'm not against her being on the show. Like I thought she did great. I saw the clips of her doing that. I thought it was phenomenal. It's just not something I would personally watch, and I felt it feels a little desperate when a lot of MMA people are just like all the time tweeting about it. And I was like, that's all I meant. I was like, good for her if she's.
I watched the finale and tweeted.
Well, it's funny though. I'd rather see. She's 22 years old. She just came off of a loss that was a pretty hard one to take. What did she do? She did something healthy for her. She went out and did this. Raised her star, right? So many, and I don't know why, but it is sort of symptomatic, I think, of women's MMA. A lot of these, there's so many cases of somebody loses a fight, and then they are on a shelf for a long time. You almost start to forget what's going on. Obviously, like Ronda Rousey has still not fought, but Carla Esparza lost her fight. She was out 13 months. Kat Zingano just disappeared after. Even Betch Kohei was out 9 months. I mean, to me,
Gina
Carano. It's like, so there's something. Maybe it's because she's so young, but you'd rather see her go out and just do something enthusiastic, get this kind of star power, and then come back, because I feel like she handled her defeat very well, and you feel like she's still got more to offer. And she'll only keep that star, though, if she's fighting for a while longer, I think, too.
I think she can headline an FS1 card.
Yeah,
Am I crazy?
Let's just be clear about this, though. Like, people who have gotten second on American Idol, they didn't have a UFC career to fall back on.
True.
But how many people do you remember who got second on American Idol? Not Justin, what was his name?
Let's see.
No, I mean, I can't tell you one person who's won Dancing with the Stars ever.
Right. Well, no, I don't think I
She
can
also
either.
came out of this looking good, like think about some of the other.
You told me earlier.
Think about some of the other UFC athletes who've gone into something non-fighting, like Rockhold. Luke Rockhold won on that what's it called, Millionaire Matchmaker.
That was
And
tremendous.
he looked like a jerk on the show. I mean, again, I don't watch these things, but my wife will say, "Oh yeah, that Luke Rockhold," and she couldn't stand him after watching his.
I actually think that helped him because that developed this persona of him being the.
But it certainly didn't push him in the.
Sure.
It pushed him as a bad guy in the fight game, but it didn't propel him outside of the fight game. This thing might propel her. She looks like someone she could do, song and dance things, and she can. It just seems to broaden her appeal. So
She's
good
so
for her.
young. She's just coming into her own.
Here's what I'll say for Skylar Aston, who might be watching this. Pitch Perfect 3.
Is it coming out?
I don't know.
Oh.
But if they make it,
I just got really excited.
Paige VanZant would be a great choice.
Can she sing though?
Can Rebel Wilson sing?
Yeah. Wow. They need Skylar to have a bigger role in that one.
That's true. That is true. Bigger role. What is going on?
Step it up,
Trying to kick him out of the show, cut him out of the deal. I'm very curious though to see if she fights on pay-per-view or FS1 or Fight Pass, is there a trickle-down effect? Okay, speaking of Paige VanZant, how about this little segue? Cody Garbrandt is headlining. Anyone get that one? No? Cody Garbrandt is...
you sly dog.
She has no love for him.
Well done, Jeff. Cody Garbrandt against Thomas Almeida, the beater of the cab drivers, as Cody has claimed. They're headlining the FS1 card on Sunday. I think that this is a very WECS card. It feels very, two bantamweights headlining in a non-title fight. If you look at the card, there's one heavyweight fight opening the show, the curtain jerker, but the rest is a bunch of bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight fights. It just feels like, traditionally the UFC has done a big show on Memorial Day weekend. This time they're doing a Sunday show in Vegas and then saving the big card for next week in Inglewood. I love this card. I really do. And it's not one that we've been talking about. It's not one that we are devoting a lot of time on this show. I just want to ask you guys before we go, fight that you're most looking forward to, because let's not forget, Fight Pass prelims.
Besides the Garbrandt fight?
You can pick that one.
Go ahead.
I don't know. I don't know if that's. Okay, there's a lot to like here, but let's not forget about the Fight Pass prelims. We talked about it a couple weeks ago. What are you picking?
I like. In one word, I like bantamweight. I love the fact that there's a bantamweight fight, sort of we talk about how there's different main events on a card. There's a bantamweight fight at the main event of the card. There's a bantamweight fight that's at the main event of the Fight Pass prelims with Aljamain Sterling against Brian Caraway, which that should be a fun fight.
Great.
And then there's also a bantamweight fight at the middle part of the card, the FS1, which is the women's bantamweight. That's
Jessica Eye against Sarah McMahon.
It's
a great fight too.
So,
do or die fight.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just gonna. You said one fight. I'm gonna just say bantamweight.
I like that.
Like all three of them.
I could dig that. What do you got?
I'm going to go with Renan Morale only because it's just going back
Great
to
story.
2005. I mean, he's lost to one guy really, and that's been T.J. Dillashaw. But yet somehow we just threw dirt on
Changing
him.
weight
He's gone.
classes.
It's changing weight classes. So there's a lot of compelling things going on in that fight, and Jeremy Stephens being no slouch. So I feel like that fight has kind of got my attention.
It's crazy that you have Barao, 135 champion, moving up to 145, facing Jeremy Stephens, who at 155 knocked out the current 155 champ brutally.
Wow, yeah.
Brutal knockout.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with Lorenz Larkin, Jorge Masvidal.
Great fight.
A bit of a do-or-die fight for both of those guys, too. Not quite as dire as McMahon versus I. But, look, I think it's not do-or-die in the sense that, they'll be cut necessarily, although Larkin's had a bit of an up-and-down career. But it's like, if one of these guys loses here, I think they become something definitively what they don't want to be, which is a guy who can beat, even good people, but you can't beat great people. And remember, Lorenz Larkin left Strikeforce beating Robbie Lawler. And look at him now. He's had some real up and down. So he looks good at welterweight. We'll see what can happen. But, Jorge Masvidal has his work cut out for him in this one.
I love all those fights. I really do. I really think that this is a very nicely constructed card. So I don't want to copy you guys. So I'll throw one out. Tarek Saffiedine against Rick Story, to me, is a fascinating fight.
That almost didn't happen.
Almost didn't happen. That's crazy. And I hope that they address it in some way. It feels like it's been completely ignored. In case you missed it, Tarek Saffiedine cut his knee. He thought he was going to be out, but then he got cleared on Monday. But to me, it's interesting because remember the last time we saw Rick Story in action was when he beat Gunnar Nelson in that main event show on October 4th of 2014. It was when they had that Rory McDonald against Saffiedine card in Halifax, and the same day, earlier in the morning, when they were doing two shows on the same day, they had Rick Story against Gunnar Nelson in Stockholm. I believe it was Stockholm or maybe somewhere else in Sweden. That's the last time we saw him. He's coming back from neck surgery. We haven't seen, he lost a lot of momentum, but after that win, remember Gunnar was climbing. This is before the Damian Maia fight. Rick Story had almost reinvented himself. And Saffiedine, to me, has never found the magic that he had in that fight against Nate Marquardt when he became the last Strikeforce champion. So I'm very curious to see what happens, how Rick's story looks. Safdien looked okay against Ellenberger, coming back from a long layoff in January. So I love that fight as well, and I'm happy that it remained on the card. So yeah, something for everyone on Sunday night on FS1. That is the card headlined by Thomas Almeida versus Cody Garbrandt. Of course, you could pick that fight as well. 2 undefeated guys. What a fantastic fight that is also. Okay, we are done. Thank you again for watching the show. Programming note, I believe we are off next week.
Yeah, we're off.
Yeah, these slackers are taking off.
I'm the one taking off.
Well, I'm going to 199, Inglewood, up to no good, California. UFC 199, can't wait for that. We'll be there for our Fight Week coverage. Also, MMA Hour next week is on Tuesday, so happy Memorial Day if you are observing that day. But for now, we say goodbye. So we're off next week. We'll be back in 2 weeks to, of course, talk about all the craziness going on in the world of MMA. So stay tuned for that. For now, I say goodbye. That is Luke. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. I am Ariel. Again, thank you so much for watching. Enjoy your weekend, and of course, enjoy the fights.